Welcome to session 3 of a lecture on international political economy entitled Industry and War 1800 to 1945. And once again we also have an unofficial subtitle, and this time it goes Why Scrooge McDuck is Not a Good Capitalist. In the bigger picture, we're now in the middle of the historic part of our lecture. Today's session will be a little bit different from the last session because now we have to talk a little bit more about economic structures, because now we reach a point in history at which capitalism actually took hold in society, and so we have to discuss a little bit more what capitalism is and how it works. And then we'll also talk a little bit more about what money is, what banks are, what free trade is. So we first discuss these four economic points, and then we come to a very brief sketch of these 145 years, and then finally I will once again discuss the main innovations of this period. So let's begin with capitalism. If we think about capitalism, some of us might think about someone like Scrooge McDuck. He's this very rich guy who wears a top hat, typically not in this picture, and who amasses great amounts of money and then takes baths in money and loves money very much and also exploits other people. And this is what many people might think a capitalist does. And today I will first ask and discuss the question, is this what a capitalist really looks like? And in order to answer this question, we first have to understand what capitalism actually is. In order to understand this, it makes sense to ask the question how production and distribution in society could be organized. If you think this way, you start with the assumption that in order for humans to live, humans need stuff. So you need maybe food, bedding, clothes, telephones, and all these kinds of things. So you need stuff, and in order for us to have this kind of stuff, the stuff has to be produced. So it has to be made in one way or the other, and then it has to be distributed among humans. And this whole system in which this production and distribution happens is the economy, and the system can be organized in a variety of ways. I think it's oftentimes helpful to ask these kind of questions and to have this kind of approach to the economy. However, this is what we would call a functionalist approach, because we look at this system in society as a system that fulfills a certain function, namely producing stuff and distributing stuff. And this helps understanding the system. However, there are some misconceptions that oftentimes come with this kind of functionalist approach. On the one hand, people tend to think that the system that functions the best will always win. And this might be true to some degree, because if a society has a totally dysfunctional system that does not produce any stuff or distribute it in any kind of way so that everyone dies, such a society will not survive. However, there's no guarantee that the optimum will take place. That this might happen, but you should not think that this is the natural way it would happen. The second misconception is that these systems are designed in some kind of way. So as if we as human beings come together and then we think about, well, how should production and distribution be organized? And then we decide for the way that we want. And then you think about history, and then you think, well, this is how capitalism came into place, because people came together and thought, well, capitalism is the most effective way of organizing this. And this is absolutely not what happened. It's something that might be possible that it happens, but it's not how history worked so far for most of the cases. Typically, it's not a conscious decision made among human beings. Typically, it's just things that happen, it's struggles, and the winner kind of have their way, and we'll see a little bit more about this in a minute. So how could production and distribution be organized? You could, for example, think of the society in which we have a total subsistence economy. This means that every person, every household or every tribe produces the stuff that they themselves need, and then everybody just keeps the stuff that they produce. And if you look back in history, you kind of see societies where it worked like this to some degree. Of course, not with individuals, but at least with some smaller units, like maybe a tribe or a household or something like that. They can see some form of subsistence economy. And this is a way we can think about it. It's then very simple to some degree, because everybody produces their own stuff, and distribution is not a problem at all because everybody just keeps their stuff. However, this is of course not probably the most effective type of production, because there's no specialization, and specialization typically comes with greater efficiency. And also there's a problem that, say, there's a very localized flooding in one village, and the people in this village lose their whole harvest, then they will starve because there is no interchange of food between producers. So this is something that could work to some degree, but it's certainly not the most effective way to organize an economy. Then you could think in the other extreme and think of a total command economy, where you have one centralized political entity that organizes production and distribution, and that tells everyone what they have to produce, and that then commands how the product is going to be distributed. And you might think of some Stalinist socialist venture here, and you kind of could make this point, but you don't have to think of modern day socialism. You can also think of some older empires. For example, you might think of the Inca Empire, where this happened to some degree. So of course they were mostly farmers and they produced the stuff they needed themselves, but what happened with the other stuff, with the surplus product, this was determined by the state. And you can see these mechanisms in a lot of societies. But you can also think of it as one extreme, where one entity determines everything that is produced and distributed, and you don't need much fantasy to see the kinds of problems that this comes with. One of the problems is, of course, that those who will actually make the decisions probably take a big share of the product. Then you can go on and think of miscellaneous forms, where you have a little bit more subsistence, a little bit more central planning. Then maybe you also have some kind of trade on markets, where maybe farmers sell the stuff that they don't need, and so others can buy it, and then you can have the central planning with more or less democracy, and you can think of all these kinds of ways of organizing the economy. And if you think very long, you possibly also at some point think of capitalism. And the point here is that capitalism is not the natural order or anything. It's just one form in which the economy can be organized, and it's the form in which we are living for the last 150 years. And although it's not the natural order or anything, it's definitely a very, very interesting form in which this is organized. So capitalism is, as Marxists would say, a mode of production. So how is capitalism defined then? You will find a lot of definitions of capitalism. Here I say that these four elements define capitalism. First, you have capitalism when the means of production, and the means of production are land, machinery, so all the stuff you need in order to produce other stuff, that these means of production are private property of a minority of the population. So they are not in the hands of the community or in the hands of the states, or they are distributed equally among the whole population, but they are private property of a group of the population, and these individuals who own this privately, they can then determine what will happen with this means of production. Secondly, the majority of the population, which does not own the means of production, they have to engage in wage labor to earn their living. So if you don't have the stuff that you need to produce the stuff that you live from, then you have to obtain the stuff that you need somehow, which means you need money, And in order for you to get money, then you have to work, which basically is what most of us will have to do in their lives. Third thing is that the key driving factor for production is profits. So when in a subsistence economy someone produces, let's say, bananas, they don't produce bananas because they want to make money from bananas, they produce bananas because they want bananas. The same is true for a command economy, only that then the bananas are not needed for the one who produces them, but for the one who the central command thinks should have bananas. In capitalism, however, whoever has the land on which you can grow bananas will grow bananas when he thinks, well, this is a good investment. If I invest my money in growing bananas, then I will make even more money from it. So I will make a profit. And this is the driving force of production. It is important to note here that this is not a moral critique. So this is not about saying that the capitalists are so mean, they only grow bananas when they can make a profit from it, and they don't grow bananas when I need bananas. You can make this argument, but this is not the point here. You can also argue the other way around with Adam Smith and say, well, I rather rely on the banana producer to produce bananas because he wants to make money from it, rather than relying on him producing bananas because he's such a good person and wants everyone to have bananas, because I believe that his interest in profit is a much better motivation to do this than his interest in giving everyone what they want. And so I have a higher trust in his greed, if you want to call it that, than in his graciousness. So you can argue one way or the other, but it's not about morals here, it's about what defines capitalism. And capitalism is defined by the fact that production is driven by the strive for profits. And finally, all the things that are produced in capitalism become commodities that can be bought and sold on markets. So in capitalism, you don't produce stuff to give it away, you don't produce stuff to consume it yourself, but you produce stuff in order for it to become commodity. So what does this imply? First, it implies that capitalism is not about hoarding money. It's not about earning $1 million and then storing them away in your money bin. Capitalism is about capital accumulation. That means if you are so lucky to earn $1 million, then you don't put them on your bank account and are happy that you have $1 million. What you do in capitalism, rather, if you are a capitalist, is take this $1 million and invest it somewhere. In theory, you build some kind of small factory, and then you have people work in the factory and produce stuff there. And if you're lucky, after a year, you might have $1 million and $100,000 more, and so on and so on. So your capital becomes more and more capital, and this capital becoming more capital is what we call capital accumulation. And by doing so, you keep the machinery of production running and running ever faster, and you keep the growth of the economy growing ever faster. What this does to the economy is that there is a rapid expansion of production, of productivity, of innovation, and this happened in capitalism to a scale to which it never ever happened before. So part of this is driven by the fact that there's not only one capitalist, but there is some type of competition. It's sometimes more competition, sometimes less competition, but there is competition. So you always have to do better than the others do if you are a capitalist. And this leads to the fact that there's always innovation in production. So you always want to produce more efficiently, to sell better stuff for cheaper prices. And in theory, this leads to an increase in productivity. At least it contributes to it. So capitalism is definitely a force of innovation, and a force of innovation to a degree that was never seen before. However, you must also say that capitalism had to be enforced at great human cost. And you can easily see that if you look at the definition that I gave you at the beginning, because in order to have this kind of economy in which the means of production are concentrated among a minority of the population and in which the majority of the population will have to engage in wage labor to do their living, that's a condition that has to be made at first, which means that a lot of the population had to be separated from their means of production, from their land. And then the textbook describes this a little bit further. You also have had to force people to actually go into factories and work, because this was not attractive to human beings at all in the 19th century, even less attractive than it would be today for most of us. So, bottom line here is that Scrooge McDuck is not a good capitalist. He's only a hoarder who is wasting money, because in capitalism, if you hoard money in a money bin, then you're wasting money because you're not reinvesting it and you're not having it become more. Of course, the description of Scrooge McDuck is also that of a capitalist, because his money becomes ever more, but the whole description is incoherent, because if he hoarded all his money in his money bins, then it wouldn't become more. In order for it to become more, he has to spend the money to buy new means of production, to buy new factories, and so on, where he then produces product or has others produce products, which he can then sell and have them become more money. So it's either that he's not a good capitalist, or that this is not a very good description of capitalism that Karl Marx gave us there. A couple of more points about capitalism. The first relates to the relation between the state and the economy, or the market, or capitalism. There's often this misconception that there is an opposition between the state and capitalism, or the state and the market. And you hear this kind of talk from the friends of the state as well as from the friends of the market. So the friends of the market will say, well, the market, that's the place where effective allocation happens, and then the state comes and ruins everything. The others argue, well, the state is the instance that grants commonwealth, that grants better distribution of wealth, and the market is where the evil stuff and the greed happens. You can make these cases, and if you differentiate a little bit further, there might be some merit to them. However, first you have to account for the fact that in capitalism, the state and the economy, they are not opposites, they are complements. So before I just argued that the capitalist economy has to be enforced at great human cost. And this is something that the state had to do. So private property has to be enforced by the state. So what the state first has to do is to enforce the expansion of capitalism. And then after capitalism is established, then the state has to deal with some consequences of capitalism. So while some people think that in our liberal economies the state shrunk as compared to the past when the state was so important, and now we have this great market organizing everything and the state kind of is in withdrawal, if you look at the actual history of capitalism, the opposite is the case. In the time in which capitalism evolved, the state expanded vastly. It first had to expand to enforce capitalism, and then it had to expand even further to deal with the consequences of capitalism, to deal with the consequences of human beings having to engage in wage labor and then having to live through economic crisis. And so first the state that guarded the property had to evolve, and then the welfare state had to evolve, because otherwise people would probably not be willing or able to live with capitalism. So in capitalism, you have to think of the economy and the state as complements and not simply as opposites. The next point I want to address is economic crisis. You can ask yourself, what will cause an economic crisis? If you take a strictly common sense perspective, you might want to think that if the economy is about production and distribution of stuff, then a crisis will emerge when there is too little production or when there's bad distribution. So if the economy is organized in a way that there is not enough stuff for everyone, so that people will in the end be hungry or naked or whatever lack of stuff you can think of. And this makes sense at first glance, and if you look over the history of human beings, this sometimes was the case. So there were economies in which there were these kinds of supply crises where there just wasn't enough stuff for everyone, and this then results in famines, for example. In capitalism, however, crises oftentimes work the other way around. Their crisis will emerge when there's too much production and too little consumption. This can happen this way because, as I argued before, capital is all about capital accumulation. It's about capitalists taking their money, investing it in production in order to make more money from it. But they will only do so if they can act under the prospect or under the impression that people will buy the stuff that they will produce there, so they can earn more money than they invest. If they, however, get the idea that people won't be able or willing to buy their stuff, then they might just hold on to their money and be like Scrooge McDuck and thereby be bad capitalists, as I argued before. And this can happen if they look at the market and see, well, people in general don't have the money to buy all the stuff that's on the market, and there's already too much stuff on the market. So if there are already too many bananas and too many cars on the market, and people don't have the money to buy them, there is no consumption, so you won't start producing more cars or more bananas because you believe that you won't be able to sell them, and so you become a bad capitalist like Scrooge McDuck. And this, of course, only happens because people cannot eat all bananas they want to eat and drive all the cars they want to drive, but they can only do so if they have the money to buy the stuff that they want. However, if the capitalists then see, well, people are not buying enough, I rather restrain from producing more stuff, then even fewer people will have work, people will have even less money, and so they will be even less able to buy all the stuff. And this is how a capitalist crisis can emerge, for example. Short side note, right now we have a rather exceptional capitalist crisis in the COVID-19 pandemic, because now we don't only have this kind of demand crisis that I just described, we also have a supply crisis because certain production chains were cut off due to quarantine measures and so on. The next point about capitalism I want to make refers to the three approaches that I laid out in the very first session. What I said so far about capitalism is mainly what you would read in Marxist or Keynesian perspective. However, none of what I said was so controversial that any economist would probably say the opposite to it. However, there are different ways to look at capitalism still. And for these different ways, typically different terms are used. So if you look at classical and neoclassical literature, typically they don't speak of capitalism, they rather speak of the market economy. And what do they mean when they say there's a market economy? They mean we have a form of the economy in which the allocation of scarce resources is primarily organized by markets, while the role of the state is limited. And they say this about the same thing that I just described as capitalism, and you can describe it this way because markets do organize all these things. So we have commodity markets, we have capital markets, we have a labor market, and so it's true that all these resources are organized by markets. If you take a Marxist or somewhat other critical perspective on capitalism, you would not say that it's about markets, you would say it's a mode of production in which the means of production and thereby the command over production are separated from the producers, and so we have a very undemocratic form of the economy. And there is this expression by Marxist theorist Evgeny Pashukanis, who said, in capitalism we have on the one side the republic of the market where everything is equal, on the other hand we have the despotism of the factory where we have a very strict command, and the liberals only look at the one side of it and don't see the other side of it. If you are a neoclassic, you would say, well, in the market economy, this decision over production, so the decision if there will be production, the decision what will be produced, is determined by market mechanisms, and because it's determined by market mechanisms, the allocation of the factors of production, so land, labor, and capital, is somewhere near optimal. If, however, you're a Marxist theorist, then you would rather say, well, the decision over production is determined by the profit interests of the capitalists and not by human needs. And therefore we have a problem here. However, most Marxists also admit that overall production is greater than it has ever been before. Finally, how would you evaluate this system then? If you are a classical or neoclassical theorist, you would say, well, this is effective, this is rational, and this is exactly what we want. If, however, you're a Marxist or some other kind of critic of capitalism, you would say, well, what we have here is class domination, it's irrational, because here you have crisis when there's too much stuff, how stupid is this? And therefore you would say, this is undesirable. And so you see that different theoretical approaches interpret the same facts in different kind of ways and come to different conclusions.